Empires rarely collapse the way people imagine. There is no single day when flags are lowered and borders erased, no trumpet announcing the end. What actually happens is quieter, slower, and far more dangerous. The system keeps functioning, markets open, institutions hold meetings, laws remain on the books, and beneath that surface, the structure that once made everything possible begins to hollow out. This pattern is old, older than nations, older than currencies. It appears wherever a dominant system grows so successful that it forgets the conditions that made that success possible. First comes expansion, territorial, financial, institutional. Then comes complexity, then dependence. The system no longer produces enough to sustain itself, so it compensates. It borrows, it prints, it extracts from the future to preserve the present. For a long time, this works. Spain did it with silver. Britain did it with credit. The Soviet Union did it with resource allocation and coercion. Each believed its structure was unique. Each believed its reach guaranteed permanence. Each mistook motion for strength and scale for resilience. And each continued forward long after the internal math no longer worked. Collapse does not announce itself as collapse. It arrives disguised as normalization, as policy, as innovation, as temporary measures that quietly become permanent. The early stages feel like progress. The middle stages feel like management. The late stages feel stable, even prosperous, because the system has learned how to mask its own decay. What makes this pattern so dangerous is not ignorance, it is familiarity. People living inside a late-stage system do not feel like participants in decline. They feel like beneficiaries of sophistication. The mechanisms grow more complex. The narratives more refined. The explanations more convincing. And the distance between real productivity and perceived wealth widens without triggering alarm. History shows this separation again and again, when the flow of value accelerates but stops circulating internally, when consumption rises while output stagnates, when debt replaces discipline, when institutions shift from enabling production to managing perception. None of this looks like failure in real time. It looks like success under pressure. By the time the consequences become undeniable, the options are gone. Adjustments that once would have been painful but survivable are now impossible. Every correction threatens the entire structure. Every reform destabilizes what little confidence remains. So the system continues forward, not because it is strong, but because stopping would reveal how weak it has already become. This is the moment that appears most often in the historical record, the point where the end is not imminent, but it is locked in, where outcomes are no longer determined by choice, but by accumulated incentives set in motion decades earlier. And once a system reaches this phase, it does not reverse. It completes the pattern. What matters is not whether this has happened before. What matters is that it always ends the same way, and the people living through it rarely recognize where they are until history has already moved on. Collapse at scale is not an event. It is a process, and it does not begin with riots, invasions, or political extremism. Those are late symptoms. Systemic collapse begins economically, long before it becomes visible socially or politically. It begins when a system's internal incentives stop rewarding productive behavior and start rewarding extraction, leverage, and proximity to power. In healthy systems, value is created before it is distributed. Productivity leads, consumption follows. Capital flows toward activities that expand future capacity. Over time, successful systems naturally grow larger and more complex. Complexity itself is not dangerous. The danger appears when complexity outpaces the system's ability to generate real value beneath it. At first, the imbalance is small. Output slows, but confidence remains high. Debt fills the gap. Financial instruments evolve to smooth volatility. Risk is dispersed, repackaged, and redefined. The system becomes better at managing symptoms than addressing causes. This is the early phase where decline feels indistinguishable from modernization. As the imbalance deepens, incentives shift. It becomes more profitable to move money than to make things, more efficient to arbitrage rules than to innovate. Institutions once designed to support production pivot toward preserving stability, even if that stability is artificial. Productivity growth weakens, consumption does not. The difference is financed. This is where collapse frameworks emerge. While historians describe them differently, the structure is consistent. Systems move through recognizable stages. Expansion establishes dominance. Financialization amplifies reach. Debt replaces surplus. Confidence becomes a policy objective. And eventually, credibility fractures. Whether defined as 5 stages or 7, the sequence is the same. Each stage builds logically on the last, narrowing future options while increasing short-term comfort. The critical transition happens when debt is no longer used to invest in future capacity, but to maintain existing expectations. At that point, growth becomes cosmetic. Numbers improve while fundamentals erode. The system still functions, but it no longer heals. Every intervention creates dependencies that require larger interventions later. Collapse accelerates when feedback loops break. Price signals distort. Risk is mispriced. Failure is suppressed instead of resolved. The system grows fragile, not because it lacks resources, but because it cannot tolerate stress without intervention. Resilience gives way to rigidity. From the inside, this phase feels managed, controlled, rational. From the outside, it looks inevitable. History shows that once a system reaches this point, decline becomes a matter of sequence, not speculation. The remaining stages are not chosen. They are experienced. And it is within this framework, quiet, methodical, and cumulative, that past empires completed their trajectories, believing they were adapting, while in reality they were advancing deeper into the pattern. Spain in the 16th century appeared unstoppable. It controlled vast territory across Europe and the Americas, commanded the most powerful navy of its time, and sat atop what seemed like an infinite supply of wealth. Silver poured in from the New World in quantities never before seen. For a brief period, Spain became the central artery of the global economy. Money flowed through Madrid, Seville, and Antwerp with astonishing speed. But that flow concealed a weakness. Spain did not build an internal productive base capable of absorbing and multiplying that wealth. The silver entered the system, but it did not stay. It passed through, used to pay foreign creditors, fund distant wars, import manufactured goods, and sustain a court culture that consumed far more than it produced. The empire grew rich without becoming productive. This imbalance reshaped incentives. Why invest in domestic industry when silver could buy everything abroad? Why cultivate efficiency when conquest delivered revenue? Spain's economy tilted toward extraction and redistribution rather than innovation and output. Inflation followed. Prices rose faster than wages. Local producers were squeezed out by cheaper foreign goods paid for with imperial silver. The very wealth that made Spain dominant hollowed out its economic core. To sustain its commitments, Spain borrowed aggressively, using future silver shipments as collateral. Debt became structural. As costs rose and revenues fluctuated, the crown debased currency and renegotiated obligations. Defaults were not accidents. They were recurring policy tools. Each one preserved the system temporarily while eroding trust permanently. Social consequences followed predictably. Wealth concentrated at the top and in the court. Productive classes shrank. The state grew larger as the private economy weakened, creating dependence rather than resilience. Military spending remained enormous, not because it was affordable, but because it was necessary to maintain the appearance of dominance. By the time silver inflows slowed, the system had no internal engine left to compensate. Spain still had territory. It still had armies. It still had prestige. What it lacked was flexibility. Any attempt to reform threatened collapse. Any reduction in spending exposed insolvency. The empire lingered, increasingly brittle, until external shocks revealed what internal decay had already guaranteed. The pattern was clear in hindsight: rapid expansion, external wealth inflows, declining domestic productivity, rising debt, monetary distortion, social stratification, and finally, loss of confidence. Spain did not fall because it ran out of silver. It fell because it never learned how to function without it. The wealth flowed through the system, but it never rooted itself within. And once the flow slowed, there was nothing left to hold the structure together. Britain followed a different path, but arrived at the same destination. By the 19th century, it was the most powerful system the world had ever seen. Unlike Spain, Britain did build a productive core. It industrialized first, mastered global trade routes, and anchored its power in manufacturing, energy, and finance. For a long time, the system worked exactly as intended. Productivity surged, wages rose, capital accumulated, confidence was earned. And that success produced a dangerous belief that Britain's position was permanent. As the empire matured, its structure shifted. Manufacturing leadership gradually gave way to financial dominance. London became the center of global credit. Capital increasingly flowed toward managing wealth rather than generating it. Overseas investments outpaced domestic reinvestment. Returns were higher abroad. Labor at home grew more expensive. The incentives changed quietly, but decisively. Debt expanded, not recklessly, but confidently. The pound's status allowed Britain to borrow cheaply and indefinitely. Trade deficits were tolerated because capital inflows compensated for them. The system appeared balanced even as its industrial base eroded. This was framed not as decline, but as evolution. Britain, it was said, had moved up the value chain. The belief that this time is different took hold. Past empires had collapsed through mismanagement or corruption. Britain saw itself as rational, disciplined, and institutionally superior. Its legal system, financial markets, and global reach were treated as guarantees against the historical pattern. Warning signs were acknowledged, then dismissed. The world wars accelerated the underlying process. To survive, Britain liquidated assets, expanded debt, and leaned fully into financial mechanisms to sustain power. Victory preserved status temporarily, but at enormous cost. Afterward, the empire still existed on paper, but its economic foundation had shifted irreversibly. Productivity lagged, debt constrained policy. Confidence depended increasingly on narrative rather than output. The final transition was slow and largely peaceful. There was no dramatic collapse. Britain's power receded as obligations outgrew capacity. The pound lost its dominance. The empire dissolved. Living standards adjusted downward relative to rising competitors. The system adapted, but only after completing the full arc of the pattern. What makes Britain's case so instructive is not failure, but delay. The system remained functional long after its peak. It felt stable until it wasn't, and throughout, the belief persisted that sophistication and experience could override structural reality. They could not. The stages repeated under different conditions, with different tools, but with the same outcome. And once again, collapse arrived not as chaos, but as normalization. By the late 20th century, the pattern resurfaced under a new banner. The system was larger, faster, and more technologically advanced than anything before it. Its reach was global, its currency universal, its institutions deeply embedded in daily life across continents. And like those before it believed scale itself had rewritten the rules. The modern system did not expand through conquest or colonies. It expanded through finance, consumption, and confidence. Productivity surged early, driven by innovation, energy, and demographic growth. But over time, the balance shifted. Growth became increasingly dependent on credit. Debt expanded faster than output. Consumption rose independently of wages. Asset prices replaced productivity as the primary signal of success. This was not the result of bad intentions. It was the outcome of incentives. Policies rewarded borrowing over saving, leverage over resilience, scale over durability. Monetary expansion became a stabilizing tool, then a structural necessity. Each intervention reduced volatility in the short term while increasing fragility in the long term. The system learned to survive shocks by absorbing them into its balance sheet. As financialization deepened, value creation and value capture drifted apart. Entire sectors grew around managing existing wealth rather than expanding productive capacity. Capital concentrated where returns were fastest, not where foundations were strongest. Meanwhile, the real economy slowed. Productivity gains became harder to extract. Labor participation weakened. The gap was filled once again with debt. Confidence became the linchpin. As long as trust in institutions, currency, and markets held, the system functioned. And for a long time it did. Crises were met with coordinated responses. Failures were contained. Each recovery reinforced the belief that adaptation had replaced vulnerability. But structurally, the incentives continued to degrade. Risk was normalized. Fragility was reframed as efficiency. Dependence was mistaken for integration. The system did not break because it was poorly managed. It weakened because it was managed too well for too long, smoothing away every signal that once forced correction. At this stage, collapse is no longer dramatic. It is procedural. Decisions become constrained by past commitments. Every solution requires expansion of the same tools that caused the imbalance. Reform becomes politically and economically impossible without triggering instability. The system advances not toward renewal, but toward completion. This is the stage where historical parallels stop feeling abstract, not because outcomes are imminent, but because the underlying mechanics are fully engaged. The trajectory narrows. The margin for error disappears. And stability, paradoxically, becomes the clearest indicator that acceleration is near. Late-stage systems always feel safest just before they move fastest. The mechanisms are familiar by this point. Institutions are experienced. Decision-makers are credentialed. Models are sophisticated. Volatility appears contained. And because past interventions have worked, the assumption forms that future ones always will. This is where acceleration begins. In the final phases of systemic decline, risk does not rise suddenly. It becomes routine. Practices that once would have triggered alarm are absorbed into baseline expectations. Larger deficits are justified as necessary. Higher leverage is normalized as efficient. Extraordinary measures quietly lose their label and become permanent features of the system. What was once unthinkable becomes merely technical. Narratives adapt to support this normalization. Language shifts. Fragility is reframed as resilience. Dependence is described as coordination. Control is presented as stability. Institutions tasked with warning of risk find themselves managing confidence instead. Not out of malice, but because confidence itself has become a structural requirement. Without it, the system cannot function even at its diminished capacity. Warnings still exist, but they lose force. They are absorbed, debated, and delayed. Each warning that does not immediately materialize becomes evidence that the system is stronger than critics believe. This creates a feedback loop where caution is interpreted as misunderstanding and restraint is seen as irresponsibility. Action is deferred not because leaders are blind, but because every available action carries unacceptable short-term consequences. Acceleration occurs when the system can no longer tolerate correction. Small failures that would once have been resolved locally now threaten cascading effects, so they are suppressed. Losses are socialized. Signals are dampened. The system grows quieter, smoother, and more artificial. From the outside, this looks like control. From the inside, it feels like necessity. History shows that this is the point of no return, not because collapse is imminent, but because adaptability is gone. The system has optimized itself for survival within a narrow range of conditions. Any deviation, economic, political, or external, requires responses that deepen the very imbalances being managed. And so acceleration is not marked by panic, but by calm, by professionalism, by the steady application of tools that no longer solve problems, only postpone recognition. The structure holds, right up until it doesn't. Because by the time instability is visible, the capacity to respond has already been spent. History does not repeat because people fail to learn. It repeats because systems are built on incentives, and incentives outlast memory. Each generation inherits structures shaped by past success, then adapts rationally to the pressures those structures create. Over time, the logic that once produced strength begins producing fragility, not through error, but through consistency. What emerges across centuries is not a story of villains or incompetence, but of alignment. Individuals act in ways that make sense locally and immediately. Institutions respond to preserve stability. Policies are designed to prevent pain in the present. And collectively, these reasonable choices compound into outcomes no one explicitly chose. This is why collapse feels impersonal when viewed from a distance. Empires do not fall because they abandon discipline all at once. They fall because discipline becomes incompatible with survival inside the system they have built. The tools that once enforced restraint become sources of risk. The behaviors that once ensured resilience become politically or economically impossible. Cycles persist because success changes behavior. Abundance reduces caution. Stability encourages leverage. Sophistication replaces redundancy. Each phase feels like progress, and in many ways, it is. Until the conditions that allowed progress no longer exist, and the system is left managing consequences rather than creating capacity. The most unsettling truth in the historical record is not that collapse happens, but that it happens without malice. People do not intend to weaken the systems they depend on. They simply respond to incentives as they are, not as they once were. And when those incentives finally break, the outcome feels sudden only to those who were never looking beneath the surface. Understanding this pattern does not grant immunity from it. Awareness does not reverse trajectories already set in motion, but it does restore clarity. It replaces shock with context, and it reframes decline not as failure, but as completion. Civilizations rise by solving problems. They fall when the solutions themselves become the problem. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.